A cold, dismissive glance sliced through the dimly lit lobby of the towering San Francisco apartment building like a blade through silence. The concierge, a man whose name was barely whispered beneath layers of dust and indifference, bore that gaze night after night, his tired eyes reflecting not anger, but a deep, quiet resilience that had been forged in the furnace of invisible labor. The marble floors gleamed under fluorescent lights, polished to perfection by hands that were never acknowledged, maintained by a soul that was never seen. I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're sweeping a hallway right now, your keys jangling softly as you check the last lock of the night. Maybe you're sitting in a security booth, watching monitors that flicker with the lives of people who pass you by as if you were furniture. It doesn't matter what time it is, what shift you're working, or how many years you've been the invisible guardian of someone else's world. I promise you, today's story will shake something deep inside your chest, something that's been waiting to be recognized for far too long. Meet Samuel Rodriguez, a man whose 53 years had been lived mostly in the shadows of other people's brightness. His once broad shoulders now carried the weight of decades spent bending to pick up what others had dropped, fixing what others had broken, maintaining what others took for granted. Samuel was the concierge, though that title seemed too small for what he truly was, the living, breathing soul of the Glenwood Towers, an opulent residential masterpiece that rose 42 stories into the San Francisco sky like a monument to wealth and ambition. Every evening, as the fog rolled in from the bay, and the city's neon lights began their nightly dance on rain-slicked streets, Samuel moved through the building with the quiet grace of someone who had learned to exist without disturbing the peace of those more important than himself. His hands, weathered and strong, held the building's master keys with a reverence that bordered on sacred, each key a responsibility, each responsibility a burden he carried without complaint. The soft, metallic melody they made as he walked was the soundtrack to his solitude, a gentle chiming that echoed through marble corridors where his footsteps had worn invisible paths of devotion. But tonight, like every night for the past 3 months, that melody would be interrupted by the sharp click of Italian leather shoes on marble, announcing the arrival of Khalid al-Mansouri, the building's new owner, an imposing figure whose fortune had been built through strategic investments in cryptocurrency and San Francisco's booming tech real estate market. His wealth was measured not just in millions, but in the kind of generational money that bought silence, respect, and the luxury of looking right through people like Samuel as if they were transparent. Khalid's presence filled the lobby like expensive cologne mixed with the cold authority of old money. His silk suits, tailored in Milan and worth more than Samuel's annual salary, moved with the confidence of someone who had never doubted his place in the world's hierarchy. At 38, he possessed the kind of sharp, angular handsomeness that opened doors and commanded attention. But his eyes held a coldness that could freeze the warmest soul, and they were always, inevitably, fixed on Samuel with barely concealed contempt. "Still here, old man?" Khalid's voice carried the faint accent of someone educated in both London and Harvard, each word carefully chosen to remind Samuel of the vast distance between their social positions. "I'm surprised they haven't replaced you with something more efficient, perhaps a security system that doesn't require feeding." Samuel's response was always the same, a slight nod, a murmured, "Good evening, Mr. Al-Mansouri," and then silence. But beneath that silence, beneath the gray uniform and the tired eyes, Samuel observed everything. He noticed how Khalid's expensive watch caught the light just so when he gestured dismissively. He cataloged the faces of the women who sometimes accompanied the millionaire to his penthouse, noting which ones returned and which ones disappeared forever. He memorized the pattern of late-night phone calls that echoed down from the 42nd floor, conversations in Arabic that grew increasingly heated as the months passed. Samuel had 3 qualities that had survived 40 years of being treated as invisible furniture: an infinite capacity for patience, a dignity that couldn't be purchased or destroyed, and an observational skill so sharp it could cut through the thickest layers of deception. While Khalid saw only a tired old man in a uniform, Samuel saw everything, every visitor, every delivery, every whispered conversation in the elevator, every small lie that rich people told themselves to sleep better at night. The morning fog was just beginning to lift from the bay when Samuel began his daily ritual, the same routine he had followed for 12 years at Glenwood Towers. His alarm clock, a simple plastic thing that had outlived 3 of his employers, buzzed at 4:30 a.m. in his modest studio apartment in the Mission District. The walls were thin, and he could hear Mrs. Chen next door preparing for her shift at the dim sum restaurant, the familiar sounds of another invisible worker beginning another invisible day. Samuel's breakfast was instant coffee and toast, eaten while standing at a single window that looked out onto a narrow alley where delivery trucks rumbled past before dawn. He dressed in his gray uniform, pressed the night before, cleaned and maintained with the same meticulous care he applied to every aspect of his work. The fabric was sturdy but unremarkable, designed to be functional rather than fashionable, to blend into backgrounds rather than command attention. The 40-minute bus ride to the financial district gave him time to read, usually library books about history or biographies of people who had overcome impossible odds. Today, it was a book about the Dust Bowl, about farmers who had lost everything but refused to lose their dignity. Samuel found comfort in these stories, in the quiet heroism of people who endured what others could not even imagine. By 6 a.m., he was unlocking the service entrance to Glenwood Towers, breathing in the familiar scent of polished marble and filtered air that smelled of money and climate control. The building was a masterpiece of modern architecture, all clean lines and glass walls that offered breathtaking views of the bay. But Samuel knew its secrets, the pipes that needed constant attention, the elevator that made a subtle grinding noise on the 23rd floor, the ventilation system that required daily monitoring to prevent the kind of problems that would disturb the residents' comfort. His rounds began in the basement, checking the building's mechanical systems with the thoroughness of someone who understood that small problems ignored became big problems that cost fortunes to fix. He monitored the backup generators, tested the fire suppression system, verified that the building's security cameras were functioning properly. These cameras, he had noticed, seemed to have convenient blind spots in certain areas, particularly near the penthouse elevator and the private entrance that Khalid used for his more discreet visitors. By 8 a.m., Samuel was in the lobby, positioned at his desk behind a marble counter that gleamed like water under the morning light. From here, he could see everything, every resident who left for work, every visitor who entered, every delivery person who needed directions. He signed for packages, sorted mail, answered phones with a professional courtesy that had been perfected over decades of invisible service. Mrs. Patterson from the 15th floor always stopped to chat about her grandson's baseball games. Mr. Yamamoto, a retired businessman, would nod respectfully and sometimes comment on the weather in careful English. These small interactions were the highlights of Samuel's day, brief moments when he was seen as a person rather than a function. But at 9:15, like clockwork, the private elevator would chime, and Khalid would emerge for his morning departure to whatever empire required his attention. The transformation in the lobby was immediate and palpable. Conversations stopped, eyes averted. The very air seemed to grow thinner, as if the building itself was holding its breath in the presence of its owner. Khalid never acknowledged the other residents' greetings, never returned their careful smiles. His attention was laser-focused on his phone, on his stock portfolio that fluctuated by millions each day, on currency trades and cryptocurrency investments that generated passive income while he slept. But he always, inevitably, found a moment to notice Samuel. "I see you're still using that ancient computer system," he would say, gesturing toward the desktop that Samuel used to manage building operations. "In my businesses, we've upgraded to blockchain-based management systems, much more efficient than this." He would wave dismissively at Samuel's workspace, his tone suggesting that both the computer and its operator were relics from a bygone era. Or, I noticed the lobby plants look a bit tired. Perhaps you could learn something about proper maintenance by watching some YouTube videos, assuming you know how to use YouTube. The cruelty was always wrapped in seemingly helpful suggestions, making Samuel appear incompetent while denying him the dignity of direct confrontation. Samuel would respond with the same quiet professionalism. "I'll take care of it right away, Mr. Al-Mansouri." But inside, something was building, not anger exactly, but a deep awareness of injustice that settled in his chest like sediment in still water. He had been humiliated by wealthy people before, but Khalid's cruelty had a systematic quality that felt particularly deliberate, as if Samuel's humiliation was not just a byproduct of the millionaire's arrogance, but its actual purpose. After Khalid left each morning, the building would exhale, and Samuel would continue his rounds. He tended to the rooftop garden, watering plants and replacing flowers with the same gentle attention he gave to everything in his care. From 42 floors up, San Francisco spread out below him like a promise, the bay sparkling in the morning sun, the hills rolling toward distant horizons, the city pulsing with the dreams and struggles of millions of people, most of whom, like Samuel, were invisible to those who lived in towers like this one. The afternoon brought different rhythms, residents returning from work, children coming home from expensive private schools, the evening shift of workers who kept the building running after the sun went down. Samuel coordinated with security guards, maintenance staff, and cleaning crews, managing the complex choreography that kept Glenwood Towers functioning as the exclusive haven its residents expected. But his real education happened in the spaces between his official duties, in the conversations he overheard, the documents he glimpsed, the patterns he observed. Samuel knew which residents were having affairs, which ones were struggling with addiction, which marriages were crumbling behind facades of success. He knew which businesses were failing, which investments were souring, which secrets were worth killing to protect. And increasingly, he was learning things about Khalid al-Mansouri that the millionaire would have paid dearly to keep hidden. Late-night phone calls in Arabic that grew more desperate each week. Visitors who arrived through unconventional entrances and left looking worried. Financial documents that sometimes fell from briefcases, documents that Samuel retrieved and returned without reading, officially. But Samuel did read them, carefully and completely, because his years of invisible observation had taught him that knowledge was sometimes the only power that powerless people possessed. And what he was learning about Khalid's business empire would have shocked even the millionaire's harshest critics. Beneath the facade of cryptocurrency success and real estate brilliance was a foundation built on increasingly desperate financial maneuvers, loans against loans, investments that were really gambling, and partnerships with people whose own wealth had very questionable origins. Samuel didn't judge. Judgment was a luxury he couldn't afford. But he observed, remembered, and filed away information with the methodical precision of someone who had learned that today's insignificant detail might become tomorrow's crucial truth. The crisis began on a Tuesday morning in October, when the fog hung low over the bay like a gray blanket, and the building's heating system hummed with the first whisper of approaching winter. Samuel was performing his routine inspection of the penthouse floor, checking smoke detectors and replacing air fresheners, when he noticed something glinting near the private elevator that served only Khalid's residence. It was a small jumble of keys on a silver ring, partially hidden beneath a decorative planter. Samuel's first instinct was to return them immediately to the lost and found, but something made him pause and examine them more carefully. These weren't ordinary house keys. They were the kind of specialized access keys used for safety deposit boxes, storage facilities, and high-security areas. Attached to the ring was a small USB drive, no bigger than a thumbnail, and a plastic key tag with a sequence of numbers that meant nothing to Samuel, but were obviously significant to someone. Samuel pocketed the keys, intending to turn them in to building security after his shift. But before he could leave the penthouse floor, the elevator opened and Khalid stepped out, his face flushed with anger and his usually perfect hair slightly disheveled. "You," he snapped, pointing at Samuel as if he were an object rather than a person. "Have you been up here today?" "Yes, sir. Routine maintenance check. I do it every Tuesday." "Did you see anything unusual? Anyone who shouldn't have been here?" Samuel shook his head, his hand unconsciously moving to his pocket where the keys rested. "No, sir. Everything appeared normal." Khalid's eyes narrowed, and for a moment Samuel felt like a suspect under interrogation. "My watch is missing. A Patek Philippe, worth more than you make in 5 years. It was in my bedroom this morning, and now it's gone." His voice rose with each word, echoing off the marble walls of the hallway. "The only people with access to this floor are security, housekeeping, and maintenance. That means you." "Mr. El-Mansouri, I would never." "Don't." Khalid held up his hand like a traffic cop stopping an oncoming car. "Don't insult my intelligence with protests of innocence. You people always think you can cry poverty and will believe you're incapable of theft." The words hit Samuel like physical blows. You people. As if his entire identity could be reduced to his economic status, his uniform, his visible powerlessness in the face of Khalid's wealth and authority. "Sir, I've worked in this building for 12 years without any problems. Perhaps if we called the police." "The police?" Khalid laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "And have them investigate what? A valuable item disappearing when the only people present were building staff? Do you think they're going to fingerprint every surface and launch a CSI investigation for a missing watch?" Samuel felt the ground shifting beneath his feet, the careful stability he had built over years of dedicated service suddenly crumbling like a sandcastle at high tide. "If you believe I took your watch, then call them. I have nothing to hide." But even as he said it, Samuel realized the futility of his position. Who would the police believe? A millionaire businessman or a 53-year-old concierge with no resources to mount a defense? Who had the credibility, the connections, the ability to shape narrative? In disputes between the powerful and the powerless, truth was often less important than perception. By that evening, word had spread throughout the building with the speed of gossip in a small town. The millionaire's watch was missing, and the concierge was suspected of theft. Some residents looked at Samuel with suspicious new eyes, as if they were seeing him clearly for the first time and not liking what they observed. Others avoided his gaze entirely, embarrassed by the situation, but unwilling to involve themselves in a conflict between their building's owner and its staff. Samuel worked his shift in a fog of disbelief and growing dread. Every interaction felt charged with unspoken accusations, every routine task performed under an invisible cloud of suspicion. When Mrs. Patterson collected her mail, she avoided his eyes. When Mr. Yamamoto passed through the lobby, he nodded curtly instead of offering his usual friendly greeting. At home that night, Samuel sat at his small kitchen table and examined the keys he had found. The USB drive was encrypted, password protected, impossible for him to access with his limited technological skills. But the keys themselves told a story. They were new, barely used, and one of them was clearly for a safety deposit box at a bank whose logo he recognized from financial district billboards. Samuel had never stolen anything in his life, not even a pen from an employer's desk or a sandwich from a shared refrigerator. The idea of theft went against everything he believed about honor, dignity, and the kind of person he wanted to be. But he was beginning to realize that his personal code of ethics might be irrelevant in a world where accusation could become conviction simply through repetition and authority. The next morning brought official humiliation in the form of a meeting with building management, Khalid, and a security consultant who had been hired to investigate the theft. Samuel sat in a conference room he had cleaned hundreds of times, facing 3 men in expensive suits who looked at him as if he were already guilty. The security consultant, a thin man with cold eyes in the manner of someone accustomed to extracting confessions, laid out the case against Samuel with the precision of a prosecutor. Access, opportunity, motive, financial difficulties that Samuel didn't actually have, but which were assumed based on his salary and social position. "Let's make this easy," the consultant said, leaning forward across the table. "We know you took it. The only question is whether you still have it or if you've already sold it. If you cooperate now, maybe we can work something out. But if you force us to involve law enforcement, things get much more complicated." Samuel felt the walls of the conference room closing in around him, but he kept his voice steady. "I didn't take Mr. Al-Mansouri's watch. I've never stolen anything in my life." Khalid slammed his hand on the table, making everyone jump. "Enough! I don't have time for this charade. You're fired. Security will escort you out, and if my watch doesn't turn up within 48 hours, I'm calling the police." The building manager, a nervous man who had always treated Samuel with professional courtesy, avoided his eyes. "Samuel, I'm sorry, but given the circumstances, we'll need your keys and any building property in your possession." Samuel reached into his pocket and placed his official building keys on the conference table. The keys that had been his responsibility and pride for 12 years, each one representing trust that was now being revoked based on suspicion rather than evidence. But he kept the mysterious keys he had found, the ones that might be his only chance of proving his innocence or understanding what was really happening in the shadows of Glenwood Towers. That afternoon, Samuel walked out through the lobby he had maintained with such care, carrying a small cardboard box containing his few personal items, a coffee mug, a small desk calendar, a photograph of his late mother. Residents he had served faithfully for years watched his departure with expressions ranging from embarrassment to satisfaction, as if his removal had cleansed the building of some contagion they hadn't realized was there. The fog was rolling in from the bay as Samuel stood on the sidewalk outside Glenwood Towers for the last time as its concierge. The building rose above him like a monument to everything he would never be able to afford, never be wealthy enough to inhabit, never powerful enough to control. But in his pocket, the mysterious keys pressed against his leg like a promise of secrets yet to be revealed. The weeks that followed Samuel's dismissal passed like a fever, dream of uncertainty and gradually diminishing hope. San Francisco was an expensive city for someone with steady employment. For a 53-year-old man with a suddenly questionable employment history, it became a gauntlet of rejection and disappearing bank balances. Samuel's savings, carefully accumulated over years of modest living and automatic deposits, began evaporating with the relentless mathematics of urban survival. Rent, utilities, food, bus fare, expenses that had seemed manageable on a concierge's salary became increasingly impossible to sustain without any income at all. He applied for unemployment benefits, but the process was slow and the payments would barely cover his basic needs. He searched for similar positions at other luxury buildings throughout the city, but word traveled fast in the tight world of high-end residential management. A quiet phone call here, a whispered conversation there. And suddenly, Samuel's name was associated with theft, unreliability, questions about character that made him unemployable in the only profession where his decades of experience offered any advantage. The jobs he could find were temporary, insecure, and paid a fraction of what he had earned at Glenwood Towers. He spent long nights cleaning office buildings in Soma, pushing a cart through cubicle farms where young tech workers had left behind the detritus of their success, empty energy drink cans, pizza boxes, the casual waste of people who had never known scarcity. The work was familiar, but the environment was alien, flavored with the loneliness of spaces designed for productivity rather than human habitation. During the days when he should have been sleeping, Samuel found himself walking the city, riding buses aimlessly, sitting in libraries where he could use the computers for free internet access. He researched the mysterious keys he had found, trying to understand their significance without revealing his possession of them. The numbers on the key tag corresponded to a safety deposit box system, but accessing that information required resources and connections that Samuel didn't possess. But Samuel was patient in the way that only truly powerless people could be patient, not passively, but with the active determination of someone who understood that time could be a weapon if wielded correctly. He began to piece together fragments of information about Khalid al-Mansouri's business empire, using public records and news articles to build a picture of the millionaire's financial activities. What he discovered was troubling, but not surprising. Khalid's wealth was newer and more precarious than his confident demeanor suggested. His cryptocurrency investments, while profitable in the short term, were increasingly concentrated in volatile assets that could collapse overnight. His real estate portfolio was leveraged to dangerous levels, dependent on continued appreciation in San Francisco's inflated property market. Most concerning of all, several of his business partnerships involved individuals and companies with connections to money laundering investigations and international financial crimes. Meanwhile, as Samuel scraped together enough quarters for laundromat visits and counted bus fare from jar of accumulated change, Glenwood Towers was beginning to show signs of his absence in ways both subtle and increasingly obvious. The first problems were minor: burned-out bulbs in hallway fixtures that stayed dark for days, elevators that made unfamiliar noises without anyone noticing, until residents began complaining, security cameras that developed blind spots, because no one understood the maintenance schedule that Samuel had created and followed religiously. Khalid had hired a replacement concierge, a young man named Derek, who was enthusiastic, but lacked Samuel's institutional knowledge about the building's quirks and requirements. Derek was efficient with basic tasks, but he didn't understand the building's rhythm, the subtle signs that indicated emerging problems, the delicate balance of relationships between residents, staff, and building management that Samuel had maintained through years of careful attention. By November, the problems were becoming serious enough to affect resident satisfaction. The heating system, which Samuel had monitored and maintained with preventive care, began experiencing failures that required expensive emergency repairs. A water leak in the basement went undetected until it caused significant damage to storage areas and mechanical systems. The building's internet infrastructure, installed in a complex configuration that Samuel had documented meticulously, failed repeatedly because Derek couldn't interpret the technical notes and diagrams that Samuel had left behind. Khalid found himself spending increasing amounts of time dealing with building management issues that had previously been invisible to him. Residents who had never complained about anything were suddenly vocal about declining service quality, maintenance problems, security concerns that hadn't existed when Samuel was managing day-to-day operations. More troubling for Khalid were the growing problems in his business empire that seemed to coincide with his personal troubles. A cryptocurrency investment that had looked promising in September crashed in October, wiping out millions in paper profits and forcing him to liquidate other assets to meet margin calls. A San Francisco development project hit regulatory obstacles that his lawyers said might be insurmountable, trapping capital that he needed for other ventures. His partners were becoming restless, asking uncomfortable questions about liquidity, demanding documentation that Khalid was reluctant to provide. Phone calls that had once been social became increasingly formal and confrontational. Late-night meetings in expensive restaurants became tense negotiations over the future of investments that were suddenly worth much less than anyone had anticipated. But Khalid's pride prevented him from acknowledging any connection between Samuel's departure and the cascade of problems that followed. To admit that a concierge had been essential to his building's smooth operation would be to admit that he had misjudged the situation, that his arrogance had cost him something valuable. Instead, he blamed Derek, blamed building management, blamed the residents, blamed everyone except himself for the deteriorating situation. Samuel, working his third part-time job in as many months, heard about these developments through the informal network of building service workers who shared information like an underground intelligence service. Security guards, maintenance workers, cleaning staff, they all talked to each other, and word of Glenwood Towers' troubles spread quickly through San Francisco's invisible army of service workers. Some of Samuel's former colleagues expressed sympathy for his situation, but most were too concerned about their own job security to risk association with someone who had been fired for alleged theft. The few who reached out did so carefully, meeting him in neutral locations away from their workplaces, offering small gifts of food or information as gestures of solidarity that they couldn't afford to make public. Through these conversations, Samuel learned that the investigation into the missing watch had quietly ended without resolution. No evidence of theft had been found, no recovered property, no criminal charges filed. The watch had simply vanished, and after the initial drama of Samuel's firing, the incident had been forgotten by everyone except Samuel himself. But Samuel hadn't forgotten because he carried the weight of false accusation like a stone in his chest, a constant reminder of injustice that made every day feel like a struggle against forces beyond his control. He had been branded a thief without trial, convicted by assumption, sentenced to poverty and professional exile without the opportunity to defend himself. On a rainy December evening, as Samuel sat in his deteriorating studio apartment eating instant ramen and trying to calculate whether this month's earnings would cover next month's rent, he finally decided to take a risk that could either restore his reputation or destroy what little remained of his life. The next morning, Samuel took the mysterious keys he had found to a locksmith in the Mission District, an elderly man named Miguel who had been serving the neighborhood for 30 years and who asked no questions about origins or purposes. Miguel examined the keys with professional interest and confirmed Samuel's suspicions. They were indeed for safety deposit boxes, and the numbers on the key tag corresponded to a specific bank's coding system. "You want to know which bank?" Miguel asked, polishing one of the keys with careful attention. Samuel nodded, knowing that this information could be the first step toward either vindication or deeper trouble. "Bank of San Francisco, downtown branch. These are current keys, probably issued within the last 6 months." Miguel handed the keys back to Samuel with a knowing look. "Whatever you're planning, amigo, be careful. These kinds of keys usually belong to people who don't like surprises." Samuel spent the rest of the day walking through downtown San Francisco, past the gleaming towers of the financial district where men like Khalid made and lost fortunes with keystrokes and phone calls. He stood outside the Bank of San Francisco, watching people enter and exit with the casual confidence of those who had never doubted their right to be there, who had never been questioned about their presence or purpose. That afternoon, Samuel purchased a small digital camera with money he couldn't afford to spend, money that should have gone to groceries or utility bills. But he was beginning to understand that desperation and dignity could sometimes require the same course of action, that proving his innocence might require him to take risks that innocent people shouldn't have to take. The USB drive remained password protected and unreadable, but Samuel had developed a theory about its contents that made his heart race with possibility and terror. If his suspicions were correct, the drive contained information that could explain not only the missing watch, but the entire web of deception and financial manipulation that surrounded Khalid's business empire. But proving his theory would require Samuel to cross lines that he had never imagined crossing, to risk criminal charges of his own in order to expose the crimes of others. It would require him to become the kind of person he had never been, someone willing to fight back against power, someone capable of using knowledge as a weapon instead of accepting injustice as inevitable. As the winter rain continued to fall on the city, Samuel realized that his life had reached a turning point from which there could be no retreat. He could accept his fate as an accused thief, disappear into the shadows of temporary jobs and diminishing prospects, carry the weight of false accusation until it crushed what remained of his hope. Or he could take the keys and the drive and whatever courage he possessed and find out what secrets Khalid al-Mansouri was so desperate to hide that he would destroy an innocent man's life to protect them. The choice, Samuel understood, was between dying slowly from injustice or risking everything on the possibility of truth. Winter in San Francisco brought a different kind of cold. the damp chill that penetrated to the bone and made Samuel's small apartment feel like a refrigerator with barely functional heating. His unemployment benefits had been approved, but they covered less than half his basic expenses, forcing him into an increasingly desperate juggling act between rent, utilities, and food. Samuel had lost 20 pounds since his dismissal from Glenwood Towers, not from illness, but from the mathematics of poverty, choosing to pay the electric bill instead of buying groceries, walking miles instead of taking the bus, eating once a day instead of 3 times. His clothes, once professionally pressed and maintained, began to show the wear of someone who couldn't afford dry cleaning or replacements. But physical deprivation was easier to bear than the psychological weight of injustice that pressed down on him like a heavy blanket. Samuel had spent his entire adult life believing that hard work, honesty, and dignity would be rewarded, or at least recognized. The discovery that these qualities could be liabilities in a world where perception mattered more than truth had shaken his fundamental understanding of how society functioned. Yet, even as his body weakened from stress and poor nutrition, Samuel's resolve had been growing stronger. The mysterious keys and USB drive had become more than potential evidence. They were symbols of possibility, reminders that even the most powerless people sometimes possessed information that the powerful would kill to protect. Samuel's research into Khalid's business empire had continued during long hours at public libraries, where free internet access allowed him to trace connections between companies, investigate regulatory filings, and piece together a picture of financial activities that became more troubling the deeper he looked. Khalid's most recent ventures involved partnerships with shell companies registered in countries known for banking secrecy and minimal financial oversight. His cryptocurrency investments were concentrated in digital currencies that had been flagged by international financial authorities as potential vehicles for money laundering. Most disturbing of all, several of his real estate acquisitions had been financed through complex arrangements with investors whose own wealth had connections to international organized crime. Samuel began to understand that the missing watch might have been less important than what the investigation would have revealed if it had been conducted thoroughly. A real police investigation would have required searches, documentation, interviews that might have exposed financial crimes far more serious than simple theft. By January, the deterioration of Glenwood Towers had become impossible for Khalid to ignore or blame on others. The building's mechanical systems, deprived of Samuel's preventive maintenance and institutional knowledge, were failing with increasingly expensive consequences. A heating system breakdown in February cost $60,000 in emergency repairs and temporary accommodations for residents. An elevator failure trapped Mrs. Patterson between floors for 3 hours, leading to threats of lawsuits that required expensive legal consultations to resolve. More significantly, the building's security systems had developed problems that Derek, the replacement concierge, was unable to diagnose or repair. Cameras went offline randomly, access codes stopped working without explanation, and the building's digital records became corrupted in ways that suggested either sophisticated cyber attacks or fundamental system failures. These security problems had consequences that extended far beyond resident inconvenience. Khalid's business meetings, many of which took place in his penthouse office, required absolute privacy and security. The knowledge that the building's surveillance and access systems were unreliable made it impossible for him to continue conducting sensitive business on site. But relocating his operations to hotels or other offices meant exposing his activities to documentation and oversight that he had been able to avoid when operating from his private residence. Khalid found himself constrained in ways that affected his ability to manage the increasingly complex financial maneuvers required to maintain his business empire. Samuel learned about these developments through his network of former colleagues, but also through his own observations as he occasionally visited the neighborhood around Glenwood Towers. From public sidewalks and coffee shops, he could see the building with new eyes, noticing problems that would have been invisible to residents but were obvious to someone with his maintenance background. The rooftop garden that Samuel had tended with such care was dying from neglect. Windows that should have been clean were streaked and dirty. Even the lobby plants that Khalid had once criticized Samuel for maintaining inadequately were wilting and brown, creating an impression of decline that affected the entire building's atmosphere. These visible signs of deterioration were symbolic of deeper problems, but they also represented opportunity. Samuel began to understand that his dismissal had created a gap that no one else could fill, not because they lacked good intentions, but because they lacked his specific knowledge, experience, and commitment to the building's welfare. On a foggy March morning, Samuel made a decision that required more courage than he had ever possessed. He dressed in his cleanest clothes, took the mysterious keys and USB drive, and walked to a legal aid clinic in the Mission District where attorneys provided low-cost services to people who couldn't afford private representation. The lawyer who met with Samuel was a young woman named Maria Santos, recently graduated from law school and passionate about fighting injustice even when the cases didn't pay well. Samuel told her the entire story: his dismissal, the false accusations, his suspicions about the keys and USB drive, his research into Khalid's business activities. Maria listened with the careful attention of someone who understood that poor people's stories were often dismissed or ignored by the legal system. When Samuel finished his account, she was quiet for a long moment, then asked to examine the physical evidence he had brought. "This USB drive," she said, turning it over in her hands. "You found it attached to these keys near where the watch was allegedly stolen?" Samuel nodded. "The same day, maybe an hour before Mr. Al-Mansouri discovered it was missing." "And you believe it contains evidence related to the theft?" "I believe it contains evidence related to something much more serious than theft," Samuel replied, "but I can't access it without the password, and I don't have the resources to hire computer experts or private investigators." Maria explained that accessing password-protected files without permission could be illegal, but that there might be ways to approach the situation that would provide legal protection for Samuel while exposing any crimes that the drive might document. She agreed to take his case pro bono, partly because she believed in his innocence, but mostly because she recognized the broader social justice implications of his situation. "Samuel," she said as their meeting concluded, "I want you to understand that this process could take months or even years. And there's no guarantee we'll be able to prove your innocence or expose whatever Mr. Al-Mansouri might be hiding. Legal battles between poor people and rich people are rarely fair fights." Samuel understood the risks, but he also understood that doing nothing would mean accepting defeat, allowing injustice to become permanent, letting false accusations define the rest of his life. "Ms. Santos, I've been invisible for most of my working life. Maybe it's time to be seen." Over the following weeks, Maria began the complex process of building a case that could challenge Khalid's accusations while protecting Samuel from criminal charges. She filed motions for access to the building's security footage from the day of the theft, requested documentation about the watch's value and ownership, and began the delicate process of investigating Khalid's business activities through public records and regulatory filings. The legal system moved slowly, but Samuel had learned patience through years of invisible service. While Maria worked on the formal aspects of his case, Samuel continued his own investigation, spending long hours in libraries and using free internet access to trace financial connections that might explain why someone with Khalid's wealth would be willing to destroy an innocent man's life over a missing watch. By April, Samuel's research had revealed a pattern of business activities that suggested Khalid's empire was far more precarious than it appeared. His cryptocurrency investments had lost over 60% of their value since November, forcing him to liquidate real estate assets at unfavorable prices to meet debt obligations. Several of his business partners were under investigation by federal authorities for financial crimes, creating liability risks that could extend to Khalid's own enterprises. Most significantly, Samuel discovered that Khalid was in violation of several banking regulations related to his real estate investments, violations that could result in criminal charges if discovered by federal investigators. The missing watch, Samuel began to realize, might have been a distraction, a way of removing someone who had observed too much, who might have been called as a witness in investigations that could destroy everything Khalid had built. The breakthrough came in May when Maria's legal motions finally compelled Glenwood Towers management to provide security footage from the day of the theft. The footage was incomplete. Several cameras had malfunctioned on that specific day, creating gaps in coverage that seemed too convenient to be coincidental. But one camera had captured something crucial: a woman entering and leaving Khalid's penthouse during the time period when the watch went missing. The woman was elegant, expensively dressed, and clearly familiar with the building's layout. More importantly, she was carrying a small bag when she left that she hadn't been carrying when she arrived. Maria showed the footage to Samuel, who immediately recognized the woman as someone he had seen multiple times during his years as concierge. She was Yasmin al-Rashid, a socialite who had once been romantically involved with Khalid, but whose relationship with him had ended badly several months before the theft. "This changes everything," Maria said, pausing the footage at a frame that clearly showed Yasmin's face. "We have evidence that someone else had access to the penthouse on the day of the theft, someone with apparent motive for revenge against Mr. al-Mansouri." Samuel felt a complex mixture of vindication and sadness as he watched the footage. Vindication because it proved his innocence, but sadness because it confirmed his cynical understanding of how easily powerful people could manipulate truth when it served their purposes. "What happens now?" he asked. Maria smiled for the first time since taking his case. "Now we use this evidence to prove your innocence and expose the real thief. And if Mr. al-Mansouri has been hiding other crimes, we make sure those get exposed too." But as Samuel left the legal clinic that day, he understood that proof of innocence was only the beginning of a longer journey toward justice. The evidence might clear his name, but it couldn't restore the months of poverty and humiliation he had endured, the damage to his reputation and employment prospects, the psychological scars left by false accusations and systematic dismissal. Justice, Samuel was learning, was not the same thing as vindication, but it was a start. The revelation that Yasmin al-Rashid had been in Khalid's penthouse on the day of the theft triggered a cascade of events that moved faster than Samuel had anticipated. Maria Santos, armed with video evidence and a growing file of suspicious financial activities, was no longer fighting a defensive battle against false accusations, but mounting an offensive campaign against what appeared to be a conspiracy to cover up multiple crimes. The first breakthrough came when Maria's investigator managed to trace the safety deposit box keys that Samuel had found. The numbers led to 3 different boxes at the Bank of San Francisco, all registered under shell companies that were ultimately controlled by Khalid. More importantly, the bank's records showed that one of the boxes had been accessed on the same day that the watch went missing, and the access code used belonged to someone with Khalid's authorization level. Maria filed a motion requesting a court order to examine the contents of the safety deposit boxes, arguing that they contained evidence relevant to the theft investigation and Samuel's wrongful termination case. Khalid's lawyers fought the motion aggressively, but their resistance only strengthened Maria's argument that the boxes contained evidence that their client was desperate to hide. While the legal battle over the safety deposit boxes was unfolding, Maria hired a computer forensics expert to examine the USB drive that Samuel had found. The expert, a former FBI analyst named David Chen, approached the password-protected drive with the same methodical patience that Samuel brought to building maintenance. David's initial attempts to crack the encryption were unsuccessful, but his analysis revealed metadata that provided crucial information about the drive's origins and contents. The files had been created over a period of several months using financial software and encryption tools that suggested sophisticated money management activities. Most tellingly, the drive contained fragments of deleted communications in Arabic, English, and what appeared to be banking codes from multiple countries. Whoever created these files was managing complex international financial transactions, David explained to Maria and Samuel during a meeting in his cramped downtown office. The encryption is military grade, but the deletion pattern suggests that someone was trying to hide evidence of illegal activities. Samuel listened to this explanation with growing amazement. The keys he had found by accident, the USB drive he had carried for months without understanding its significance, represented evidence of crimes far more serious than simple theft. He had stumbled into a conspiracy that involved international money laundering, cryptocurrency fraud, and financial partnerships with known criminals. But David's most significant discovery came when he managed to recover fragments of communication logs that had been incompletely deleted from the drive. The logs showed encrypted messages between Khalid and associates in several countries, discussing asset transfers and regulatory avoidance in language that was clearly designed to disguise illegal activities. One message fragment caught Samuel's attention because it mentioned Glenwood Towers specifically. Building security compromised, relocate sensitive operations immediately, liquidate SF assets if necessary. The message was dated 3 days after Samuel's dismissal, suggesting that his removal had been part of a larger plan to eliminate potential witnesses to whatever crimes were being committed from the penthouse office. Maria used these discoveries to expand her legal strategy beyond Samuel's wrongful termination case. She contacted federal authorities, providing evidence of potential money laundering and financial fraud that fell under FBI jurisdiction. She also reached out to local media, understanding that public pressure could be as effective as legal pressure in forcing accountability from powerful criminals. The media attention began slowly. A brief story in the San Francisco Chronicle about a wrongfully terminated concierge who had evidence of financial crimes. But the story resonated with readers who understood the dynamics of powerful people scapegoating innocent workers, and social media amplified the narrative in ways that traditional journalism could not. Samuel found himself thrust into a role he had never sought, the public face of a David versus Goliath battle against corporate corruption. Reporters wanted interviews, social justice organizations offered support, and people who had never heard of Glenwood Towers began following his story as a symbol of working-class dignity, confronting elite arrogance. The attention was overwhelming for someone who had spent decades being invisible, but Samuel handled it with the same quiet dignity that had sustained him through months of false accusations and poverty. He spoke carefully and truthfully, focusing on facts rather than emotions, letting the evidence speak louder than his personal grievances. By June, federal investigators had opened formal investigations into Khalid's business activities, using the evidence that Samuel and Maria had provided as the foundation for broader inquiries into international money laundering networks. Bank accounts were frozen, business assets were seized, and several of Khalid's associates were arrested on charges ranging from cryptocurrency fraud to financing terrorism. Khalid himself remained free, but was clearly under intense investigation. His lawyers issued statements denying all wrongdoing and characterizing the investigations as harassment based on fabricated evidence provided by a disgruntled employee seeking revenge. But Khalid's public denials were contradicted by his private actions. He began liquidating assets rapidly, moving money to offshore accounts and distancing himself from business partners who were facing criminal charges. His penthouse at Glenwood Towers went up for sale at a price that suggested desperation rather than market calculation. Samuel watched these developments with a complex mixture of satisfaction and unease. The man who had destroyed his life was facing consequences far more severe than simple embarrassment, but Samuel took no joy in anyone's suffering, even someone who had caused him so much pain. The legal resolution of Samuel's case came in July, When Khalid's lawyers approached Maria with a settlement offer that included full vindication of Samuel's innocence, substantial financial compensation for wrongful termination and defamation, and a public apology acknowledging that the theft accusations had been false. Samuel's first instinct was to reject any settlement that allowed Khalid to avoid accountability, but Maria counseled patience and pragmatism. "The criminal investigations will proceed regardless of our civil case," she explained. "But this settlement can restore your reputation immediately and provide you with resources to rebuild your life." Samuel understood the wisdom of her advice, but he insisted on one condition that surprised even Maria. He wanted a face-to-face meeting with Khalid before any settlement was finalized. Not for revenge or confrontation, but for something harder to achieve and more personally important: acknowledgement of the human cost of false accusations. The meeting was arranged for August, in a neutral conference room at Maria's law office. Samuel arrived early, wearing a suit he had purchased with advance money from the settlement, the first new clothing he had bought in over a year. He wanted to look professional, dignified, equal to the man who had tried to destroy him. Khalid arrived late, accompanied by 2 lawyers and looking older than his 38 years. The stress of federal investigations and collapsing business empire had taken a visible toll. His hair was graying, his expensive suit couldn't hide rapid weight loss, and his famous arrogance had been replaced by a careful wariness that suggested someone who knew he was being watched and judged. The 2 men sat across from each other in silence for a long moment, each seeing the other clearly for the first time. Samuel saw not a powerful millionaire, but a frightened man whose carefully constructed world was crumbling around him. Khalid saw not an invisible servant, but a person whose dignity had survived attempts to destroy it, whose quiet strength had proven more durable than wealth and status. "I want you to know," Samuel said finally, his voice steady and calm, "that I never took your watch. I never took anything from you or anyone else. I've worked honestly my entire life, and your accusations nearly destroyed that." Khalid nodded, unable to meet Samuel's eyes. "I know. The real thief was found weeks ago. Yasmin sold the watch to pay gambling debts and implicated you to protect herself. I should have corrected the record immediately." "Why didn't you?" Khalid was quiet for a long time before answering. "Because admitting I was wrong about you meant admitting I was wrong about everything. My business problems, my security issues, my entire life was falling apart, and blaming you was easier than facing the truth about my own failures." Samuel felt something unexpected in that moment, not satisfaction at Khalid's humiliation, but a kind of sad recognition of shared humanity. "I accepted your insults for months because I needed the job, but I never accepted that they were true. Dignity isn't something you can give or take away from another person. It's something you choose for yourself." The formal apology was delivered 2 days later at a press conference that drew significant media attention. Khalid, flanked by lawyers and facing a room full of cameras, read a prepared statement acknowledging that his accusations against Samuel had been false, that Samuel had been an exemplary employee who deserved recognition rather than blame. But more meaningful to Samuel was the private conversation that followed, when Khalid asked to speak with him alone for a few minutes. "I want you to know," Khalid said, his composure cracking slightly, "that you were the best employee I ever had. The building fell apart without you, and my business fell apart without the stability you provided. I destroyed something valuable because I was too proud to recognize its worth." Samuel accepted the apology, not because it restored what had been taken from him, but because it acknowledged a truth that went beyond legal settlements or media attention, that every person, regardless of their position or visibility, deserved to be seen, respected, and treated with basic human dignity. 3 months later, Samuel was offered his old position at Glenwood Towers, but with a new title, building manager, and a salary that reflected the true value of his knowledge and dedication. The offer came from the building's new ownership group, which had acquired the property after Khalid's assets were liquidated to pay legal fees and federal fines. Samuel accepted the position, not because he needed the vindication, but because he understood that Glenwood Towers needed him in ways that went beyond maintenance and security. The building had become a symbol in his personal story, and he wanted to help it represent something positive, a place where dignity was respected regardless of wealth, where workers were valued for their contributions, where invisible people could become visible through the simple recognition of their worth. On his first day back, Samuel stood in the lobby where he had been humiliated and dismissed, where he had endured months of casual cruelty from someone who possessed wealth but lacked wisdom. The marble floors gleamed again under his care, the plants were green and healthy, and the sense of order and peace that only comes from being maintained by someone who truly cares had returned to every corner of the building. Mrs. Carol Patterson from the 15th floor stopped by his desk to welcome him back, bringing homemade cookies and genuine tears of joy. Mr. Yamamoto presented him with a small gift, a keychain with a simple inscription, "To Samuel, who sees everything and judges nothing." But the moment that meant the most to Samuel came that evening as he was completing his final rounds of the day. A young maintenance worker named Carlos, recently hired and still learning the building's systems, approached him hesitantly. "Mr. Rodriguez," Carlos said, using Samuel's surname with the respect that Samuel had rarely received during his years of invisible service. "I wanted to ask you about the elevator on the 23rd floor. It's making a noise I don't understand." Samuel smiled, remembering his own early years when no one had been willing to teach him the subtle signs that indicated developing problems before they became expensive emergencies. "Come on," he said, heading toward the elevator. "Let me show you what to listen for." As they rode up together, Samuel began sharing the knowledge he had accumulated over decades of careful observation and quiet service. Not just technical information about mechanical systems, but wisdom about dignity, patience, and the quiet satisfaction that comes from work done well even when no one is watching. 5 years later, Glenwood Towers had become something unique in San Francisco's competitive luxury housing market, a building known not just for its amenities and location, but for its culture of respect and recognition for everyone who contributed to its success. Samuel had transformed the employee handbook to include specific protocols for treating all staff with dignity, regardless of their position or visibility. The building's residents, many of whom had witnessed Samuel's public vindication and return, developed a different understanding of the relationship between service and respect. They learned names, expressed appreciation, and created an environment where being invisible was no longer a requirement for employment. Samuel aged gracefully in his role as building manager, his silver hair and lined face marking him as someone who had survived tests that would have broken weaker people. He never married, having devoted his life to work and service, but he found deep satisfaction in mentoring younger workers and creating opportunities for people who might otherwise remain invisible. The mystery of the missing watch was eventually solved completely when Yasmin al-Rashid was arrested on unrelated fraud charges and confessed to the theft as part of a plea agreement. The watch was never recovered. She had sold it years earlier to finance gambling debts, but the confession provided final legal vindication for Samuel's innocence. Khalid al-Mansouri served 18 months in federal prison for money laundering and financial fraud, his business empire dismantled and his assets distributed among victims and government penalties. Upon his release, he moved to a small apartment in Oakland and took a job as a financial advisor for a nonprofit organization that helped immigrants start small businesses. Their paths crossed one last time 3 years after Khalid's release, when he came to Glenwood Towers to visit a client who lived in the building. Samuel was in the lobby when Khalid entered, both men older and changed by experiences that had tested their fundamental beliefs about justice, dignity, and redemption. They spoke briefly, politely, with the careful courtesy of people who shared a complicated history. Khalid had learned humility through loss and legal consequences. Samuel had learned strength through survival and vindication. "I think about what I did to you," Khalid said as their conversation ended. not just the accusations, but the daily humiliations, the systematic cruelty. I was trying to make myself feel powerful by making you feel small. Samuel nodded, understanding that some apologies take years to develop the depth necessary for genuine forgiveness. We both learned things we needed to learn. Maybe that's what matters now. As Khalid left the building, Samuel returned to his duties with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose life had become a testament to the power of dignity sustained through injustice, patience rewarded through persistence, and truth revealed through careful observation and unwavering integrity. The sun was setting over San Francisco Bay, painting the lobby's marble floors with golden light that transformed ordinary space into something beautiful. Samuel stood in that light, no longer invisible, no longer underestimated, but recognized finally for what he had always been, a guardian of more than buildings, a keeper of values that money cannot buy and power cannot destroy. But Samuel's story didn't end with personal vindication. It became the beginning of something larger, a movement that spread far beyond the walls of Glenwood Towers. The media coverage of his case had attracted attention from labor rights organizations, social justice advocates, and working people across the country who recognized their own struggles in his story. Samuel found himself invited to speak at conferences, union meetings, and community organizations. At first, the idea of public speaking terrified him. He had spent his entire career being invisible, speaking only when spoken to, careful not to draw attention to himself. But Maria Santos encouraged him to share his story, arguing that his quiet, dignified presence was exactly what people needed to hear. His first speech was at a small community center in Oakland, to a group of janitors, security guards, and maintenance workers who gathered monthly to discuss workplace issues. Samuel stood before them in his best suit, hands trembling slightly as he held his prepared notes. "I never wanted to be here," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never wanted to be seen, never wanted to cause trouble. I just wanted to do my job well and be left alone." But as he told his story, the false accusations, the months of poverty, the slow journey toward vindication, something remarkable happened. The room grew completely silent, not with boredom, but with recognition. These were people who understood exactly what it meant to be invisible, to be blamed for things beyond their control, to have their dignity challenged by people who possessed wealth but lacked humanity. When Samuel finished speaking, the applause was thunderous. But more than that, people approached him afterward to share their own stories of workplace injustice, discrimination, and the daily humiliations that come with being treated as less than human because of your job title or paycheck. A security guard named Rosa told him about being fired from a tech company after reporting sexual harassment, then being blacklisted from similar positions throughout the Bay Area. A janitor named Miguel described years of wage theft by employers who knew their workers were too vulnerable to fight back. A hotel housekeeper named Patricia shared how she had been blamed for items missing from guest rooms, despite having worked honestly for 15 years without any problems. Samuel realized that his story was not unique. It was representative of a pattern of abuse that affected millions of working people who had no voice, no platform, no resources to fight back against powerful employers who could destroy their lives with false accusations or arbitrary dismissals. Over the following months, Samuel began working with labor organizations to document cases of workplace injustice and provide support for workers who found themselves in situations similar to his own. He helped establish a legal fund that provided free representation for service workers falsely accused of theft or misconduct. He testified before the San Francisco Board of Supervisors in support of legislation that would strengthen protections for employees facing wrongful termination. But perhaps most importantly, Samuel became a mentor to young workers who were just beginning their careers in service industries. He taught them not just practical skills, how to maintain equipment, how to handle difficult customers, how to document their work properly, but also lessons about dignity, self-respect, and the importance of standing up for themselves even in the face of powerful opposition. Carlos, the young maintenance worker from Glenwood Towers, became Samuel's first and most devoted protege. Under Samuel's guidance, Carlos learned not just the technical aspects of building maintenance, but also the deeper principles of service with dignity. He watched Samuel interact with residents, vendors, and other workers, noting how respect was given freely, but also expected in return. "Mr. Rodriguez," Carlos asked one day as they were servicing the building's HVAC system, "how did you keep going during the worst times? When everyone thought you were guilty, when you had no money, when it seemed like everything was against you?" Samuel paused in his work, considering the question carefully. "I realized that my value as a person wasn't determined by other people's opinions or bank accounts. I had to choose every day to believe in my own worth, even when no one else would." Carlos nodded, but Samuel could see he didn't fully understand yet. That understanding would come with time and experience, as it had for Samuel himself. The legal fund that Samuel helped establish grew beyond anyone's expectations. Within 2 years, it had assisted over 300 workers facing various forms of workplace injustice. The fund's lawyers, working pro bono or for reduced fees, won dozens of cases involving wrongful termination, wage theft, discrimination, and retaliation against workers who reported safety violations or other illegal activities. More importantly, the fund's existence sent a message to employers throughout the Bay Area that workers were no longer completely powerless, that false accusations and arbitrary punishments would be challenged in court rather than accepted in silence. Samuel's role in this movement was largely behind the scenes. He preferred it that way, but his influence was unmistakable. Workers who received help from the fund often requested to meet with him personally, seeking not just legal advice, but the kind of moral support that could only come from someone who had survived similar ordeals. These meetings usually took place in small coffee shops or community centers, away from the workplaces where these individuals might be observed and face retaliation. Samuel listened to their stories with the same careful attention he had once given to building maintenance, offering practical advice when he could, but mostly providing the invaluable gift of being heard and believed. One such meeting was with a woman named Elena, a hotel housekeeper who had been accused of stealing jewelry from a guest room. The accusations were clearly false. Security cameras showed that Elena had never been alone in the room, and the guest had a history of insurance fraud. But the hotel had fired her immediately to avoid potential liability. "I've worked in hotels for 22 years, Elena told Samuel, tears streaming down her face. "I've never taken so much as a mint from a guest room, but now no one will hire me. They all think I'm a thief." Samuel recognized the pain in her voice, the bewilderment of someone who had discovered that honesty and hard work were no protection against false accusations and economic vulnerability. "Elena," he said gently, "your worth isn't determined by what they say about you. It's determined by what you know about yourself. We're going to fight this together, and we're going to win." The legal battle took 8 months, but Elena was eventually vindicated when investigation revealed that the missing jewelry had been taken by the guest's own companion, who had a gambling addiction and a history of pawning items for quick cash. Elena received a substantial settlement and was offered her old job back with a promotion, though she chose instead to work for a different hotel chain that had better policies for protecting employees from false accusations. By the 7th anniversary of his return to Glenwood Towers, Samuel had become something he never expected, a public figure in the labor rights community. His story had been featured in national magazines, documentary films, and academic studies about workplace justice. He received invitations to speak at universities, conferences, and international gatherings of workers' rights advocates. But success and recognition hadn't changed Samuel's fundamental nature. He still arrived at work early, still maintained Glenwood Towers with the same meticulous care he had always shown, still treated every person, from billionaire residents to temporary delivery workers, with the same quiet respect. The building itself had become a model for how luxury properties could operate without exploiting or dehumanizing their workers. Samuel had implemented policies ensuring that all staff received living wages, comprehensive benefits, and protection from arbitrary discipline or termination. More subtly, but perhaps more importantly, he had created a culture where workers' knowledge and experience were valued, where suggestions for improvement were welcomed regardless of their source, where dignity was considered as important as efficiency. This transformation hadn't happened overnight or without resistance. Some residents had initially objected to what they saw as coddling of staff, arguing that they paid premium prices for service and shouldn't have to worry about workers' feelings or job security. But Samuel had patiently explained that respected, secure employees provided better service than fearful, resentful ones, and that a building's reputation for treating workers well actually enhanced its desirability among discerning residents. The results spoke for themselves. Glenwood Towers had virtually no staff turnover, exceptional service ratings, and a waiting list for both residential units and employment positions. The building had become a case study in business schools, demonstrating that ethical treatment of workers was not just morally correct, but economically advantageous. Samuel's influence extended beyond his own building through the mentorship program he had established for service workers throughout the hospitality industry. Young people starting careers as concierges, security guards, housekeepers, and maintenance workers could apply for training and guidance from experienced professionals who had learned to navigate workplace challenges while maintaining their dignity and integrity. The program paired mentees with seasoned workers who had demonstrated both technical competence and strong personal character. Samuel personally vetted every mentor, looking not just for knowledge and skills, but for the kind of wisdom that comes from surviving difficult circumstances without becoming bitter or cynical. Maria Santos, the lawyer who had first taken Samuel's case, had been promoted to senior partner at her firm, largely based on the visibility and success of high-profile workers' rights cases. She remained Samuel's legal advisor and close friend, helping him navigate the complex world of labor law, media attention, and organizational politics that came with his role as an advocate for working people. "Samuel," she said during one of their regular lunch meetings, "do you ever think about how different your life would have been if you hadn't found those keys? If you had just accepted the false accusations and disappeared quietly?" Samuel considered the question seriously, as he considered all questions. "I think about it sometimes. Part of me wishes I could have just stayed invisible, done my job, avoided all this attention and responsibility. But then I meet someone like Elena or Carlos, and I realize that my story only has meaning if it helps other people avoid what I went through." Maria nodded. Understanding that Samuel's transformation from invisible building concierge to prominent labor advocate had been as much about accepting responsibility as claiming justice. On a foggy spring morning, 10 years after his dismissal from Glenwood Towers, Samuel received a phone call that would test everything he had learned about forgiveness, redemption, and the possibility of genuine change in human nature. The call came from a social worker in Oakland who explained that Khalid al-Mansouri had been diagnosed with a serious illness and had requested a meeting with Samuel. Khalid had been working with immigrant entrepreneurs for several years since his release from prison, apparently trying to make amends for the damage his financial crimes had caused to vulnerable communities. "He says he has something important to tell you," the social worker explained. "Something he should have said years ago but wasn't ready to face. He's very sick, Mr. Rodriguez. If you're going to meet with him, it should be soon." Samuel's first instinct was to decline. He had moved beyond anger and resentment, but that didn't mean he felt obligated to provide comfort to someone who had caused him so much suffering. He had built a new life based on helping others and fighting injustice. Reopening old wounds served no constructive purpose. But something in the social worker's voice suggested that this request was different from a simple desire for absolution. There was an urgency that implied unfinished business, information that might be important beyond personal reconciliation. Samuel agreed to the meeting, which took place in a small park in Oakland, where Khalid often met with clients from the nonprofit organization where he worked. When Samuel arrived, he was shocked by how much Khalid had changed. The arrogant millionaire had been replaced by a thin, prematurely aged man who looked decades older than his actual years. They sat on a bench overlooking the bay, two men whose lives had been forever altered by their brief but devastating conflict. Khalid spoke slowly, carefully, as if each word required significant effort. "Samuel, I asked to see you because I've learned things since my imprisonment that change everything about what happened between us. Things I should have realized years ago but was too proud and too frightened to face." Samuel waited, neither encouraging nor discouraging Khalid to continue. "The watch," Khalid said finally. "It was never about the watch. I knew within hours that Yasmin had taken it. The security footage was clear, and she had left obvious evidence in my apartment. But I also knew that reporting the theft would trigger an investigation that might uncover my financial crimes." Samuel had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed still stirred complex emotions. "I needed a scapegoat," Khalid continued, "someone to blame so that if the authorities did get involved, they would focus on employee theft rather than the money laundering and fraud I was conducting from my penthouse office. You were convenient, visible enough to be believable as a suspect, powerless enough that you couldn't fight back effectively." The admission was painful to hear, but not surprising. Samuel had long understood that his dismissal had been calculated rather than impulsive. "But there's something else," Khalid said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "Something I've only realized in the years since my imprisonment. The financial crimes that destroyed my business empire, they weren't just about greed or ambition. I was being blackmailed." This was new information, and Samuel found himself leaning forward despite his determination to remain emotionally distant. "Yasmin wasn't just a former girlfriend seeking revenge," Khalid explained. "She was working with a syndicate that specialized in compromising wealthy individuals through romantic relationships, then using inside information to manipulate their business dealings. The stolen watch was the least of what she took from me." Samuel began to understand the larger picture. "She had access to your financial records, your business communications, everything," Khalid confirmed, "and she used that information to force me into increasingly desperate investments and partnerships with criminal organizations. When I finally tried to break free from their control, they escalated their pressure. The theft was meant to create chaos, to give them additional leverage over me. And you chose to sacrifice me rather than admit what was really happening." Khalid nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I told myself it was self-preservation, that I was just buying time to figure out how to escape their blackmail. But the truth is I was too proud to admit how completely I had been manipulated, too cowardly to accept the consequences of my own poor judgment." They sat in silence for several minutes, watching boats move slowly across the bay. Samuel felt a complex mixture of emotions, vindication at finally understanding the full truth, but also a profound sadness at the waste and suffering that could have been avoided if Khalid had chosen honesty over deception. "Why are you telling me this now?" Samuel asked. "Because you deserved to know the truth years ago, and because the syndicate that destroyed my life is still operating, still targeting wealthy individuals, still destroying innocent people like you who get caught in the crossfire. I've been working with federal investigators to expose their network, but my credibility is limited by my own criminal history." Khalid pulled a thick envelope from his jacket pocket. "These are copies of financial records, communication logs, and evidence I've gathered about their operations. The FBI has the originals, but I thought you should have copies in case something happens to me." Samuel accepted the envelope, understanding that he was being given more than just information. He was being offered the opportunity to help prevent other innocent people from suffering similar injustice. "There's one more thing," Khalid said as their meeting concluded. "The non-profit where I work, we've established a fund for workers who have been falsely accused of crimes in connection with their employment. It's not much, and it doesn't undo the damage I caused, but it's my attempt to channel whatever time I have left into something positive." Samuel looked at Khalid with new eyes, seeing not the arrogant millionaire who had destroyed his life, but a broken man trying to rebuild something meaningful from the ruins of his mistakes. "What do you want from me?" Samuel asked. "Nothing," Khalid replied. "I wanted you to know the complete truth, and I wanted you to have the evidence that might help prevent others from going through what you experienced. Beyond that, I have no right to expect anything from you." As they parted ways, Samuel realized that this meeting had provided something he hadn't even known he was seeking. Not forgiveness or redemption for Khalid, but complete understanding of the forces that had shaped his ordeal. The knowledge that he had been caught in something much larger and more complex than simple workplace theft didn't diminish the injustice he had suffered, but it did provide context that helped him process the experience more completely. The evidence Khalid had provided proved crucial in federal investigations that eventually dismantled the criminal syndicate responsible for manipulating dozens of wealthy individuals across the United States. Several members of the organization were convicted of racketeering, money laundering, and extortion charges. More importantly, their methods were exposed in ways that helped other potential victims avoid similar manipulation. Samuel's role in providing this evidence to authorities was kept confidential at his request, but he found deep satisfaction in knowing that his ordeal had ultimately contributed to preventing similar suffering for others. Khalid al-Mansouri died 6 months after their meeting, succumbing to the illness that had motivated his final attempt at honest reconciliation. Samuel attended the funeral, not to forgive or forget, but to witness the end of a story that had shaped both their lives in profound and unexpected ways. The funeral was small, attended mostly by clients from the non-profit organization and a few family members who had maintained contact despite Khalid's disgrace. Samuel sat in the back, observing the ceremony with the same careful attention he brought to everything important in his life. The eulogies were honest about Khalid's failures, while acknowledging his attempts at redemption in his final years. Several immigrant entrepreneurs spoke about how his financial advice had helped them build successful businesses, how his understanding of both wealth and poverty had made him uniquely qualified to guide others through the challenges of economic mobility. As Samuel left the funeral, he reflected on the complex nature of justice, redemption, and human change. Khalid's crimes could not be undone. The suffering he had caused could not be erased. But his final years suggested that even the most arrogant and destructive people might be capable of genuine transformation if they were willing to face the truth about themselves and dedicating their remaining time to serving others. 15 years after his dismissal from Glenwood Towers, Samuel Rodriguez stood before the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva, delivering a speech about workplace dignity and the rights of service workers worldwide. His transformation from invisible building concierge to international labor advocate seemed impossible even to him, but life had taught him that impossible things happened when ordinary people refused to accept injustice as inevitable. The audience of diplomats, human rights advocates, and labor leaders listened intently as Samuel described the patterns of abuse that affected service workers across industries and cultures. He spoke about the way poverty and vulnerability were weaponized against working people, how false accusations and arbitrary dismissals were used to maintain systems of exploitation and fear. But Samuel's speech was not just about problems. It was about solutions, practical steps that governments, employers, and workers themselves could take to create more just and dignified working conditions. He outlined legal protections that had proven effective, workplace policies that balanced efficiency with humanity, and support systems that helped vulnerable workers defend their rights without risking their livelihoods. Dignity, Samuel concluded, his voice carrying clearly through the vast assembly hall, is not a luxury that only wealthy people deserve. It is a fundamental human right that belongs to every person who contributes their labor to society's functioning. When we allow workers to be treated as disposable, when we permit false accusations to destroy innocent lives, when we ignore the daily humiliations that accompany poverty and powerlessness, we diminish not just individual workers, but the moral foundation of our entire civilization. The standing ovation that followed was gratifying. But Samuel's real satisfaction came from the conversations afterward, when delegates from dozens of countries approached him to discuss specific legislation and policies they might implement to protect workers in their own nations. A representative from Bangladesh wanted to know about legal aid programs for garment workers. An official from Brazil asked about policies preventing retaliation against employees who reported safety violations. A delegate from Sweden inquired about training programs that helped service workers develop advocacy skills while maintaining their employment. Each conversation reinforced Samuel's understanding that his personal story had become part of a much larger global struggle for economic justice and worker dignity. The injustice he had experienced in San Francisco was being replicated in different forms across the world, affecting millions of people who deserved better than invisible suffering and silent exploitation. When Samuel returned to San Francisco after his week in Geneva, he found Glenwood Towers exactly as he had left it, impeccably maintained, efficiently operated, and staffed by workers who took pride in their roles because they were treated with respect rather than suspicion. The building had become a symbol of what was possible when labor and management worked together based on mutual recognition of each other's value and dignity. Carlos, his former protege, was now assistant building manager and had implemented several innovations that improved both service quality and working conditions. The mentorship program Samuel had started had been expanded to include partnerships with 3 other luxury buildings, creating a network of professionally trained service workers who understood both technical excellence and personal dignity. But perhaps the most meaningful development was the establishment of the Samuel Rodriguez Institute for Workplace Justice, headquartered in a modest office building in the Mission District. The institute combined legal advocacy, worker education, policy research, and public awareness campaigns to address systemic issues affecting service workers, domestic employees, and others in vulnerable employment situations. The institute's staff included former service workers who had developed expertise in various aspects of labor advocacy, lawyers who specialized in employment law, researchers who documented patterns of abuse and discrimination, and community organizers who helped workers understand their rights and develop collective strategies for protection and advancement. Maria Santos had left private practice to serve as the Institute's director, bringing her legal expertise and passion for justice to bear on cases that might otherwise go unnoticed. Under her leadership, the Institute had become one of the most effective workers' rights organizations in California, with a national reputation for both winning individual cases and changing systemic policies that affected thousands of workers. The Institute's work went far beyond legal representation. They provided financial assistance for workers facing retaliation, offered training programs that helped service employees develop skills and confidence, maintained a database of employers with poor labor practices, and published research that influenced legislation and corporate policies throughout the region. But Samuel took the most pride in the Institute's mentorship programs, which had evolved into a comprehensive support network for workers throughout the hospitality and service industries. Young people entering these fields could access not just job training, but guidance on maintaining dignity, dealing with difficult situations, understanding their rights, and building careers based on excellence rather than servility. One evening, as Samuel was completing his final rounds at Glenwood Towers, he encountered a new employee named Isabella, a recent immigrant from El Salvador who had been hired as part of the housekeeping staff. She approached him nervously, speaking in halting English mixed with Spanish. "Mr. Rodriguez," she said, "I heard about you, about what happened to you here. I wanted to say thank you for making it safe for people like me." Samuel was touched by her gratitude, but also aware of the ongoing challenges that workers like Isabella faced, language barriers, cultural differences, immigration status issues that made them vulnerable to exploitation and abuse. "Isabella," he replied in Spanish, switching to her native language to put her at ease. "The most important thing I want you to remember is that your value as a person doesn't depend on other people's opinions or their ability to pay you. You have dignity because you're human, not because you're useful to someone else." They talked for several more minutes about practical matters, workplace policies, benefits, opportunities for advancement. But Samuel could see that Isabella was most impacted by the simple recognition of her worth as a person. She'd come to work expecting to be invisible, expendable, tolerated rather than valued. Instead, she found an environment where her contributions mattered and her dignity was protected. As Samuel watched Isabella walk toward the staff elevator, he reflected on how much had changed since his own early days as a service worker. The transformation hadn't happened automatically or easily. It had required years of struggle, legal battles, policy changes, and most importantly, a fundamental shift in understanding about the relationship between those who served and those who were served. The fog was rolling in from the bay as Samuel finished his evening rounds, but the lobby of Glenwood Towers remained warm and welcoming, lit by the knowledge that everyone who worked there could go home with their dignity intact, their contributions recognized, their futures secure. It was a small victory in the larger struggle for justice, but it was real and tangible, built on the foundation of one man's refusal to accept that invisibility was the price of honest work. 20 years after his firing, Samuel Rodriguez retired from his position as building manager of Glenwood Towers. Though his retirement was more ceremonial than practical, he continued his advocacy work with even greater intensity, no longer constrained by the demanding schedule of building management. The retirement celebration was held in the building's community room, attended by residents, staff, city officials, labor leaders, and dozens of workers whose lives had been touched by Samuel's advocacy and example. The gathering was deliberately modest, reflecting Samuel's preference for substance over spectacle, but the warmth and genuine affection in the room testified to the profound impact he had made on countless lives. Mrs. Patterson, now in her 80s but still living on the 15th floor, spoke about Samuel's quiet kindness during her early years of widowhood, how he had noticed her loneliness and made sure she felt connected to the building's community. Mr. Yamamoto, retired from his business career but still residing at Glenwood Towers, presented Samuel with a calligraphy scroll expressing gratitude in 3 languages, English, Spanish, and Japanese. But the most moving tribute came from Carlos, now director of building operations, who had grown from an uncertain young maintenance worker into a confident professional leader under Samuel's guidance. "Mr. Rodriguez taught me that there's no such thing as menial work," Carlos said, his voice thick with emotion. "He showed me that every job is an opportunity to serve others with dignity, to take pride in excellence, to build something better than what you found. But most importantly, he taught me that who you are matters more than what you do, and that respect is something you give to others regardless of whether they have the power to give it back to you." Samuel's own remarks were brief and characteristically focused on others rather than himself. He thanked the residents who had supported him through difficult times, acknowledged the staff members who had maintained Glenwood Towers' reputation for excellence, and expressing pride in the younger workers who were carrying forward the principles of dignity and service that had guided his career. "When I started working here 24 years ago," Samuel said, "I thought success meant being invisible, efficient, and grateful for whatever treatment I received. I've learned that real success means being visible as a complete human being, excellent in your work because you choose to be, rather than because you're afraid not to be, and grateful for dignity while expecting it as your right rather than hoping for it as a gift." The Samuel Rodriguez Institute for Workplace Justice continued to grow and evolve under professional leadership, but Samuel remained actively involved as founder and senior advisor. His schedule was full of speaking engagements, consultation meetings with other advocacy organizations, testimony before legislative committees, and individual meetings with workers facing various forms of workplace injustice. These individual meetings remained the most personally meaningful aspect of Samuel's work. In coffee shops and community centers across the Bay Area, he listened to stories that echoed his own experience: false accusations, systematic humiliation, economic vulnerability, weaponized against honest people simply trying to earn a living with dignity. Each story was unique in its details, but familiar in its underlying dynamics. A hotel housekeeper accused of stealing from rooms she had never entered, a security guard fired for insubordination after refusing to falsify safety reports, a restaurant worker terminated for poor performance after reporting sexual harassment by management. Samuel approached each case with the same careful attention he had once brought to building maintenance, looking for patterns, identifying leverage points, understanding the complex interplay of legal, economic, and social forces that shaped each person's situation. But he also brought something that legal expertise alone could not provide: the credibility of shared experience, the moral authority of someone who had survived similar ordeals and emerged with his dignity intact. The most important thing to understand, Samuel would tell these workers, is that their actions toward you are a reflection of their character, not yours. Your worth as a person is not determined by their ability to pay your salary or their willingness to treat you fairly. Hold on to that truth, even when everything around you suggests otherwise. This message resonated particularly strongly with immigrant workers, who often faced additional layers of vulnerability due to language barriers, cultural differences, and fears about immigration status. Samuel's own background as the son of immigrants, combined with his hard-won expertise in navigating workplace challenges, made him uniquely qualified to help these workers understand both their rights and the practical strategies for protecting themselves. The Institute had developed specialized programs for different categories of vulnerable workers: domestic workers who labored in isolation and often faced exploitation by wealthy employers, received training about their legal rights, safety protocols, and strategies for documentation and communication. Restaurant workers learned about wage and hour laws, safety regulations, and how to report violations without risking retaliation. But the program Samuel was most proud of was the Leadership Development Initiative, which identified promising advocates within various worker communities and provided them with advanced training in organizing, legal advocacy, and policy analysis. These worker leaders then returned to their own communities as educators and organizers, creating a sustainable model for ongoing advocacy and support. Isabella, the housekeeper Samuel had encountered during her first days at Glenwood Towers, had become one of these leaders. After several years of stable employment and increasing responsibility at the building, she had enrolled in community college courses, learned advanced English, and eventually been promoted to a supervisory position. She now served on the Institute's board of directors and specialized in advocacy for immigrant workers in the hospitality industry. Samuel showed me that I didn't have to choose between being invisible and being unemployed, Isabella explained to a group of new workers during one of the Institute's training sessions. He taught me that I could demand respect while still providing excellent service, that I could speak up about problems without being labeled a troublemaker, that I could build a career based on skills and character rather than just accepting whatever treatment I received. Isabella's transformation from fearful new employee to confident community leader exemplified the Institute's broader impact. By providing not just legal protection but comprehensive support for personal and professional development, the organization had helped hundreds of workers escape cycles of exploitation and build sustainable careers based on dignity and mutual respect. As Samuel entered his 70s, his pace of public appearances and travel gradually slowed, but his influence continued to expand through the network of organizations, policies, and individuals he had helped create. The Institute had grown into a national organization with affiliates in 12 states. each adapted to local conditions but united by common principles of worker dignity and systemic advocacy. The legal approaches developed through Samuel's case had been adopted by labor attorneys across the country, creating a body of precedent that made it easier for future workers to challenge false accusations and wrongful termination. The workplace policies pioneered at Glenwood Towers had been implemented by dozens of other luxury buildings and hotel chains, demonstrating that treating workers with respect was not just morally correct but economically advantageous. Perhaps most importantly, the cultural shift that Samuel's story had helped catalyze was beginning to change public understanding of the relationship between service workers and the people they served. The idea that service work was inherently demeaning or that workers should be grateful for any treatment they received was being challenged by a growing recognition that all work had dignity and all workers deserved respect. This cultural transformation was slow and uneven, facing resistance from employers who had profited from workers' powerlessness and from consumers who preferred to maintain comfortable illusions about the cost of their convenience and comfort. But the change was real and measurable, visible in everything from improved wages and working conditions to increased unionization rates to greater political representation for working-class interests. Samuel's personal life during these years was quiet but deeply fulfilling. He had never married or had children, having devoted most of his adult life to work and then to advocacy. But he had created a chosen family of workers, activists, and community members whose lives had been touched by his example and guidance. His small apartment in the Mission District had become an informal gathering place for workers facing crises, young advocates seeking advice, researchers working on labor issues, and former colleagues who valued his friendship and wisdom. The walls were covered with photographs, letters, and small gifts from people whose lives had been changed through his advocacy, a visual testament to the ripple effects of one person's refusal to accept injustice as inevitable. On quiet evenings, Samuel often reflected on the strange path that had led from his humiliation in the conference room at Glenwood Towers to his current role as an internationally recognized advocate for worker dignity. The journey had been painful, uncertain, and longer than he could have imagined, but each step had built upon the previous one in ways that suggested some larger purpose, working through individual choices and circumstances. He thought often about the people who had shaped his story. Maria Santos, whose legal expertise and moral commitment had made justice possible. Carlos, whose growth from uncertain worker to confident leader demonstrated the transformative power of mentorship. Isabella, whose courage in claiming her dignity had inspired countless other immigrants to do the same. But he also thought about Khalid al-Mansouri, whose arrogance and cruelty had set the entire chain of events in motion. Samuel had long since moved beyond anger or resentment toward Khalid, but he remained grateful for the lessons that their conflict had taught him about the corrosive effects of unchecked power, the importance of systematic rather than individual solutions to injustice, and the possibility of redemption even after terrible mistakes. And you, have you ever felt invisible while you were the one holding everything together? Have you ever been blamed for problems you didn't create, dismissed by people who didn't understand your value, forced to prove your worth to those who should have recognized it from the beginning? Samuel's story reminds us that dignity is not granted by others but chosen by ourselves, that patience can be a form of strength, and that truth, however long delayed, has a power that wealth and status can never overcome. Tell me your story in the comments below. Share the moments when you felt invisible but refused to disappear, when you were underestimated but held on to your worth anyway. If this story touched something in your heart, leave a like and subscribe so it can reach someone else who needs to remember that they matter, they are seen, they are valued. For more stories that honor the dignity of quiet work and invisible service, click the podcast link. Thank you for walking with Samuel through his journey from humiliation to vindication, from invisibility to recognition. In a world that often forgets to see the people who make everything work. May we all learn to look closer, appreciate deeper, and recognize the Samuel in our own lives and the Samuel in ourselves. Samuel Rodriguez died peacefully in his sleep on a foggy San Francisco morning in late autumn, 25 years after his dismissal from Glenwood Towers, and 3 months after his 82nd birthday. He had lived long enough to see his advocacy work institutionalized through organizations that would continue long after his death, and to witness a fundamental shift in how society understood the relationship between service workers and the communities they served. His funeral was held at a community center in the Mission District, the same neighborhood where he had lived modestly for decades while building one of the most effective worker advocacy movements in American history. The service was conducted in both English and Spanish, reflecting the multicultural nature of the community he had served and the international scope of his influence. The gathering was remarkable for its diversity. Former colleagues from Glenwood Towers, Supreme Court justices who had cited his case in landmark labor decisions, immigrant workers whose lives had been transformed through the Institute's programs, hotel executives who had reformed their employment practices after encountering his advocacy work, and hundreds of ordinary people whose dignity had been preserved or restored through his example and guidance. Maria Santos, now in her 60s but still fighting for worker rights as Director Emeritus of the Samuel Rodriguez Institute, delivered the main eulogy. She spoke about Samuel's transformation from invisible building concierge to international advocate, but focused primarily on the personal qualities that had made that transformation possible. Samuel understood that injustice was not something that happened to other people in distant places, Maria said, her voice carrying clearly through the packed community center. He understood that every society is built on the labor of people who are told they should be grateful for the opportunity to serve, who are expected to accept whatever treatment they receive because they need their jobs more than their employers need them. But Samuel also understood that this arrangement was not inevitable, not natural, not the way things had to be forever. He understood that change was possible if ordinary people were willing to stand up for their own dignity and demand that others recognize it too. Carlos, now a regional director for Hotel Workers Union, and still guided by the principles Samuel had taught him decades earlier, spoke about the practical impact of Samuel's advocacy work. He presented statistics that seemed almost impossible. Tens of thousands of workers whose jobs had been saved through legal interventions inspired by Samuel's case, hundreds of millions of dollars in recovered wages, dozens of laws and regulations that now protected vulnerable employees from retaliation and false accusations. But Carlos emphasized that numbers couldn't capture the most important aspect of Samuel's legacy: the transformation in how countless individuals understood their own worth and their right to be treated with dignity, regardless of their economic circumstances. Samuel taught us that you don't have to be rich to be valuable. You don't have to be powerful to demand respect. And you don't have to be grateful for injustice just because it's common, Carlos said. He showed us that ordinary people could create extraordinary change if they were willing to stand up for what was right, even when it seemed hopeless. Isabella, now Director of Immigrant Worker Services for the Institute and fluent in 3 languages, addressed the gathering in Spanish first, then English, speaking directly to the many current service workers who had come to honor Samuel's memory. Samuel saw us when we were invisible, she said. He believed in our worth when we had forgotten it ourselves. He taught us that dignity was not something we had to earn through perfect behavior or grateful silence, but something we already possessed simply because we were human beings, contributing our labor to society's functioning. The service concluded with the reading of messages from worker advocates, government officials, and ordinary people from around the world whose lives had been touched by Samuel's story. A hotel housekeeper from Bangladesh wrote about how Samuel's advocacy had inspired legislation protecting domestic workers in her country. A janitor from Detroit described how the Institute's training programs had helped him become a union organizer. A concierge from London explained how Samuel's example had given him the courage to report workplace safety violations that might have killed someone. As the gathering dispersed, many attendees lingered to share personal memories and to commit to continuing the work that Samuel had started. The institute would continue under professional leadership, but its programs would only be as effective as the individual workers who understood their worth and were willing to stand up for their rights. In the weeks following Samuel's death, tributes appeared in newspapers across the country and around the world. The New York Times published an editorial about his impact on American labor law. The Guardian in London ran a feature story about how his advocacy model was being replicated in European countries. Workers' organizations from 6 continents sent delegations to a memorial conference that brought together advocates, researchers, and policymakers to discuss the ongoing challenges facing service workers worldwide. But perhaps the most meaningful tribute was the quiet continuation of daily work by thousands of people who approached their jobs with the dignity, integrity, and quiet confidence that Samuel had exemplified throughout his career. Hotel housekeepers who reported safety violations instead of working around dangerous conditions. Security guards who treated everyone with respect, regardless of their apparent wealth or status. Concierges who maintained buildings with the same care they would give their own homes, taking pride in excellence rather than accepting mediocrity as inevitable. Samuel's small apartment in the Mission District became a shrine of sorts, maintained by the Institute as a reminder of how simply and modestly he had lived while building a movement that transformed countless lives. Visitors could see his small kitchen table where he had eaten instant ramen while researching Khalid's financial crimes, the narrow bed where he had slept during months of unemployment and uncertainty, the simple desk where he had written speeches that were eventually delivered at the United Nations. The contrast between the modesty of his personal circumstances and the global scope of his influence served as a powerful reminder that social change often begins with individuals who have nothing to lose except their dignity and everything to gain through its preservation. Glenwood Towers continued to operate as a model of dignified employment practices, with Samuel's photograph displayed prominently in the building's community room, alongside a plaque that read, "In memory of Samuel Rodriguez, who taught us that seeing clearly and serving with dignity transforms both the observer and the observed." Carlos had been promoted to general manager of the building, implementing policies that went beyond what Samuel had originally envisioned. The building now offered college scholarships to employees' children, provided paid sabbaticals for workers who wanted to develop additional skills, and maintained a fund that helped staff members purchase homes in a city where housing costs had made home ownership impossible for most service workers. More significantly, Glenwood Towers had become a training ground for ethical building management practices, hosting visiting delegations from other luxury properties seeking to improve their employment practices. The building's success, both in terms of resident satisfaction and staff retention, provided concrete evidence that respecting workers' dignity was not just morally correct but economically advantageous. The Samuel Rodriguez Institute for Workplace Justice continued to grow and evolve, adapting to new challenges while maintaining the fundamental principles that Samuel had established. The organization now operated programs in 47 states and had affiliations with worker advocacy groups in 23 countries, but its core mission remained unchanged, providing legal protection, education, and support for workers facing exploitation, false accusations, and systematic dehumanization. The Institute's research division had become one of the world's leading sources of data about working conditions, wage theft, workplace discrimination, and the economic impacts of various employment policies. This research informed legislation at local, state, and federal levels, providing policymakers with evidence-based recommendations for protecting workers while maintaining economic competitivity. But the Institute's most innovative program was its Leadership Development Initiative, which identified promising advocates within worker communities and provided them with comprehensive training in organizing, legal advocacy, policy analysis, and media communication. These worker leaders then returned to their communities as educators and organizers, creating a sustainable model for ongoing advocacy that didn't depend on outside experts or resources. 5 years after Samuel's death, the Institute's annual conference brought together over 2,000 participants from around the world: workers, advocates, researchers, policymakers, and even some enlightened employers who had learned that treating workers well was good for business as well as morally correct. The conference's opening ceremony was held at Glenwood Towers, in the lobby where Samuel had been humiliated and dismissed 3 decades earlier. As speakers addressed the gathering from a podium positioned near Samuel's old concierge desk, the symbolism was unmistakable. What had once been a site of injustice had been transformed into a symbol of dignity and possibility. Maria Santos, now retired but still actively involved in the Institute's work, reflected on Samuel's legacy in her keynote address to the conference. "Samuel Rodriguez was not a perfect person," she said. "He was quiet when he might have spoken sooner, patient when he might have been more confrontational, modest when he might have demanded more attention for his cause. But those apparent limitations were actually sources of his strength." Samuel understood that lasting change comes not from angry confrontation, but from quiet persistence, not from dramatic gestures, but from consistent daily choices to treat others with dignity, regardless of their treatment of you. He showed us that transformation begins with individuals who refuse to accept that injustice is inevitable. But it only succeeds when those individuals build systems and institutions that outlast their personal involvement. The conference participants included workers from industries that barely existed when Samuel began his career: app-based delivery drivers, social media content moderators, artificial intelligence trainers. But the fundamental issues they faced were remarkably similar to what Samuel had experienced decades earlier. They were often invisible to the people who benefited from their work, undervalued by employers who saw them as expendable, vulnerable to false accusations and arbitrary dismissalism. But they were also better prepared to defend themselves than previous generations of workers had been, thanks in part to the legal precedents, advocacy organizations, and cultural shifts that Samuel's story had helped create. They understood their rights more clearly, had access to support networks that previous workers had lacked, and could draw on a growing body of evidence that respected workers were more productive, loyal, and innovative than fearful ones. The conference concluded with participants committing to specific actions they would take to advance worker dignity in their own communities and industries. Some pledged to start new advocacy organizations, others to run for political office, still others to begin organizing campaigns in their workplaces. But perhaps most importantly, all committed to approaching their daily work with the same integrity, excellence, and quiet dignity that Samuel had exemplified throughout his career. As the participants dispersed to return to their jobs and communities around the world, they carried with them not just knowledge and strategies, but inspiration drawn from Samuel's example. They had learned that one person's refusal to accept injustice as inevitable could create ripple effects that transformed countless other lives, that dignity was not something granted by others, but chosen by individuals, and that patient persistence in service of justice was more powerful than wealth, status, or apparent authority. The fog was rolling in from the bay as the last conference participants left Glenwood Towers, but the building remained brightly lit, its windows glowing like beacons in the gathering dusk. Inside, the night shift was beginning their work. Security guards, maintenance staff, and cleaning crews who approached their duties with the confidence and dignity that Samuel's legacy had helped make possible. They worked in a world that was far from perfect, where inequality and exploitation still existed, where workers still faced false accusations and systematic dehumanized. But they also worked in a world that had been measurably improved by one man's refusal to remain invisible when visibility meant fighting for justice, to stay silent when silence meant accepting lies, to give up when giving up meant abandoning not just his own dignity, but the dignity of countless others who faced similar struggles. Samuel Rodriguez had been gone for 5 years, but his influence continued to ripple outward through the daily choices of thousands of people who understood that how you treat the least powerful person in any interaction reveals who you really are. That service work performed with excellence and dignity elevates both the worker and the served, and that one person's commitment to truth and justice can create changes that long outlive any individual life. The lights in Glenwood Towers burned through the night, maintained by workers who took pride in their contributions to something larger than themselves, protected by policies that recognized their worth, supported by communities that understood their value. It was a small victory in the larger struggle for human dignity, but it was real and lasting, built on the foundation of one man's extraordinary journey from invisibility to recognition, from humiliation to vindication, from individual suffering to collective transformation. And somewhere in the city below, in small apartments and shared housing, the next generation of workers was sleeping, preparing for another day of service in a world slightly more just than the one Samuel had inherited, slightly more respectful of the people whose invisible labor makes everything else possible. They would face their own challenges, encounter their own forms of injustice, and have their own opportunities to choose dignity over despair, truth over comfortable lies, solidarity over isolation. But they would not face these challenges alone, because Samuel Rodriguez had built something that would outlast any individual life, a recognition that every person has worth that cannot be purchased or destroyed, that honest work performed with integrity deserves respect regardless of its apparent status, and that the measure of any society's justice can be found in how it treats the people who sweep its floors, guard its doors, and maintain the infrastructure upon which everyone else's dreams depend. The fog lifted with the dawn, revealing a city still struggling with inequality and injustice, but also transformed by the understanding that those struggles were not inevitable, that change was possible, and that ordinary people possessed extraordinary power when they refused to accept that their invisibility was the price of their survival. We'll see you in the next story, where ordinary people do extraordinary things simply by refusing to let the world make them invisible.